Don't close your eyes.
Rain lashed against the cobblestones of Mayfair as society's most untouchable man fell to his knees. He was a duke bound by centuries of ruthless tradition. She was the one woman, forbidden to him. But tonight, beneath a weeping sky, he was about to break every rule in England. London, October 1125. The air inside the Duke of Devonshire's Piccadilly mansion was thick with the scent of hothouse orchids, melting beeswax, and the quiet, venomous whispers of the British elite. It had been scarcely a year since Queen Victoria's Golden Jubilee, and the aristocracy was still riding a wave of opulence, blinding themselves to the smog and suffering of the industrial world just beyond their velvet-draped windows. Jocelyn Clara Whitmore stood near a towering column of imported Italian marble, feeling as though the heavily embroidered silk of her emerald gown was pulling her straight into the floorboards. She was 21 years old, possessed a sharp wit she was forced to hide, and carried the devastating burden of a family name teetering on the edge of total ruin. Her father, Silas Whitmore, had made terrible speculations in the South African diamond mines. When the veins ran dry, so did the Whitmore fortune. To the glittering eyes of the ton, Jocelyn was a beauty to be envied. To Lord Tobias Blackwood, she was merely a purchased asset. Tobias stood beside her, his fingers wrapped around her upper arm with a bruising, proprietary grip. He was a wealthy shipping magnate from Cornwall, a man whose newly minted millions had bought him a place in society, though the old money still looked down their noses at him. His wealth was staggering, his temper legendary, and he had eagerly bought up Silas Whitmore's debts with one specific demand in return: Jocelyn's hand in marriage. "Smile, Jocelyn," Tobias murmured, his breath hot against her ear, laced with the sharp tang of brandy. "Lord Randolph Churchill is looking this way. I will not have my future bride looking like a martyr before the most powerful men in Parliament." Jocelyn forced the corners of her mouth upward, a hollow porcelain smile. "I am smiling, Tobias. It is merely difficult to breathe when you are cutting off the circulation to my hand." His grip tightened for a fraction of a second, a silent, vicious warning, before he released her. "Do not test me tonight, my dear. The banns are red. In 3 weeks, you are mine. I suggest you learn to play the part." Across the vast expanse of the ballroom, beneath the dazzling glow of 1,000 crystal chandelier, stood Winston Smith, the 9th Duke of Ashbourne. If Tobias Blackwood was new money and brute force, Winston Smith was the ancient, unyielding bedrock of the English peerage. His family had held their lands since the Norman conquest. He was 30 years old, possessing striking, angular features, dark hair swept back from a patrician brow, and eyes the color of a stormy North Sea. He was known in the whispering galleries of Parliament as the Iron Duke, not for military exploits, but for his absolute, uncompromising adherence to duty, honor, and the rigid laws of his class. Winston was currently engaged in a dry conversation with Lady Henrietta Spencer, a woman society had collectively decided would be his perfect duchess. She was flawless, wealthy, and entirely devoid of passion. It was a strategic match, a merger of estates, and Winston had accepted it with the same stoic resignation he accepted all his ancestral duties. Yet, as the string quartet began a slow, sweeping waltz, Winston's gaze drifted past Lady Henrietta's powdered shoulder. His eyes locked onto a woman in emerald green across the room. He had noticed her earlier, of course. It was impossible not to. Jocelyn Whitmore had a quiet, defiant fire about her that stood in stark contrast to the simpering debutantes of the season. But what arrested Winston's attention now was the subtle, desperate flinch of her body when the man beside her, Blackwood, leaned in. Winston's keen eyes, honed by years of navigating the treacherous political waters of the House of Lords, missed nothing. He saw the white-knuckled grip she had on her fan. He saw the shadow of fear beneath her forced smile. And inexplicably, a spark of pure, unadulterated fury ignited in the Duke's chest. Winston knew of Tobias Blackwood. In fact, Winston knew far more about the man than anyone in the ballroom could possibly suspect. As an elite advisor to the Crown, Winston had spent the last 4 months secretly investigating Blackwood's shipping empire. The man was not just an opportunist. He was a ruthless criminal, suspected of smuggling opium and arms through the East India Company's blind spots, bribing port officials, and ordering the violent suppression of striking dockworkers in Liverpool. Blackwood was a monster hiding behind freshly tailored tailcoats, and he was about to marry the terrified girl in the green dress. "Your Grace?" Lady Henrietta's voice broke through his thoughts. "You seem distracted." Winston tore his gaze away, his expression instantly smoothing into an impenetrable mask of aristocratic politeness. "Forgive me, Lady Henrietta. The heat in this room is suddenly quite oppressive. If you will excuse me, I require some air." He did not wait for her practiced pout. Winston moved through the crowd with the effortless grace of a predator, the throngs of dukes, earls, and viscounts naturally parting for him. He was breaking a dozen silent rules of etiquette by leaving his intended companion, but as he tracked the flash of emerald silk disappearing toward the rear corridors of the mansion, the Duke of Ashbourne found, for the first time in his life, that he simply did not care. The Devonshire Conservatory was a humid, glass-domed sanctuary situated at the back of the mansion, overlooking gardens that were currently being battered by the sudden onset of a fierce October storm. Rain lashed violently against the glass panes, the rhythmic drumming a stark contrast to the delicate waltzes playing in the distant ballroom. Jocelyn practically collapsed onto a wrought iron bench hidden behind a thick cluster of imported ferns. She was trembling. She had managed to slip away from Tobias when he was cornered by a group of railway investors, citing a torn hem that needed mending. It was a lie, a brief theft of time. She pressed her hands to her burning cheeks, staring out at the darkness. The raindrops against the glass looked like tears streaming down a massive, invisible face. She was trapped. The reality of her impending marriage had finally settled over her like a shroud. Tobias would isolate her in Cornwall. He would break her spirit, piece by piece, until nothing remained but a quiet, obedient ghost. And there was no one to save her. Society turned a blind eye to the cruelty of wealthy men, and her father was too crippled by debt and shame to intervene. "It is quite foolish to hide from a predator in a glass house, Miss Whitmore." Jocelyn gasped, leaping to her feet. Her heart hammered wildly against her ribcage. Standing in the arched entryway of the conservatory, backlit by the distant glow of the mansion, was the Duke of Ashbourne. He stepped out of the shadows, his presence instantly shrinking the massive room. He looked wildly out of place among the damp earth and chaotic foliage, too structured, too immaculate, too dangerously intense. "Your Grace," Jocelyn whispered, sinking into a hurried, unsteady curtsy. I did not hear you approach. I was merely seeking a moment of respite." "You were fleeing," Winston corrected smoothly, his voice a rich, low baritone that seemed to vibrate beneath her skin. He stepped closer, his dark eyes locked onto hers. The usual coldness that the ton whispered about was absent. Instead, there was a burning, inquisitive heat. "I saw the way he looks at you. I saw the bruise forming on your arm." Jocelyn instinctively pulled her gloved hand over her bicep, her chin lifting in an automatic defensive posture. "I do not know what you mean, Your Grace. Lord Blackwood is my fiancé." "Lord Blackwood is a brute," Winston countered, taking another step forward. The scent of him sandalwood, rain, and clean linen washed over her. "And if the whispers in the gentlemen's clubs are true, Silas Whitmore sold you to him to cover a staggering debt." Jocelyn's face flushed with deep, agonizing humiliation. To have the highest-ranking peer in the room state her family's utter disgrace so casually was a physical blow. "If you have come to mock my family's poverty, Your Grace, you have succeeded. Now, if you will excuse me." She tried to brush past him, but Winston shifted his weight, blocking the narrow path between the ferns. He didn't touch her, but the sheer proximity of his large frame brought her to a halt. "I did not follow you to mock you, Jocelyn," he said, the use of her Christian name slipping out, a shocking breach of protocol that made her breath hitch. "I followed you because you are walking toward a cliff edge, and I am entirely unaccustomed to standing by while innocents plunge to their deaths." A clap of thunder rattled the glass above them, mirroring the sudden chaos in Jocelyn's chest. "I have no choice," he holds the promissory notes. "If I do not marry him, my father will be sent to Fleet Prison, and my family will be left destitute on the streets of London. I am trading my life for theirs. It is done." "It is not done," Winston said, his voice dropping to a fierce, urgent whisper. He looked over his shoulder, ensuring the corridor was still empty, before stepping dangerously close to her. "Listen to me carefully. Tobias Blackwood is under investigation by the Crown. He is involved in treasonous smuggling operations off the Cornish coast. Within a month, he will be arrested, and his assets, including his new wife, if she is tethered to him, will be dragged into the scandal." Jocelyn stared at him, her eyes wide with shock. "Treason? But he is so powerful. He dines with ministers." "He bribes ministers," Winston corrected, his jaw clenching. "And he operates with impunity because people are too afraid of his wealth to cross him. But I am not. I am building the case against him myself. But if you marry him in 3 weeks, you will be caught in the crossfire. You will be ruined, completely and irreparably." Tears, hot and unbidden, finally spilled over Jocelyn's lashes. The sheer exhaustion of her secret terror broke through her defenses. "Then I am doomed regardless," she wept softly, her hands trembling. "If I break the engagement, he destroys my family tomorrow. If I marry him, I am destroyed in a month." Winston looked down at the tears slipping over her pale cheeks. For a man who had spent his entire life building walls of duty and emotional detachment, the sight of her quiet despair felt like a crowbar to his ribs. Every instinct of his aristocratic upbringing screamed at him to step away, to offer her a polite handkerchief, to distance himself from a scandalous, impoverished scandal. Instead, Winston broke his first rule. He reached out, his warm, ungloved hand gently cupping her jaw. His thumb brushed away a tear, the touch so tender it sent a jolt of electricity straight to Jocelyn's heart. She froze, looking up into his stormy eyes, paralyzed by the sudden, intense vulnerability in the Iron Duke's expression. "You are not doomed," Winston whispered, the rain pounding violently against the glass dome above them, drowning out the world beyond. "I will not allow it." "You cannot stop him," she breathed, entirely captivated by the warmth of his hand against her skin. "You are a duke. You have your own duties, your own life. Why would you risk your unblemished name for a ruined merchant's daughter?" Winston stared at her lips, then up to her wide, frightened eyes. The truth was something he had only just realized himself, in the shadowy, rain-swept conservatory. "Because," he murmured, leaning in until their breaths mingled, "I have spent 30 years doing exactly what is expected of me. And looking at you, Jocelyn, I realize I am entirely sick of it." "Jocelyn!" The harsh, booming voice of Tobias Blackwood echoed violently down the marble corridor, shattering the fragile intimacy. Winston immediately dropped his hand and stepped back, but the air between them was still crackling with an undeniable, heavy charge. Jocelyn quickly turned her back, furiously wiping her eyes as Tobias stormed into the conservatory. Blackwood's eyes darted between the two of them, narrowing with dark, venomous suspicion. He noted Jocelyn's flushed cheeks and the Duke's rigid, towering stance. "Your Grace," Tobias said, his voice dripping with forced politeness and underlying malice. "I see you have found my fiancée. I hope she has not been boring you with her provincial chatter." Winston turned to face the industrialist, his demeanor instantly turning to ice. The warmth he had shown Jocelyn vanished, replaced by the terrifying, aristocratic coldness that had earned him his moniker. He looked at Blackwood not as a man, but as dirt beneath his polished boots. "Miss Whitmore and I were merely discussing the weather, Lord Blackwood," Winston said, his tone lethal and smooth. "Though I was just advising her that storms on the horizon can be quite devastating for those who are unprepared." Tobias's smile faltered slightly, a flicker of genuine unease passing through his eyes before he masked it. He stepped forward and seized Jocelyn's arm again, pulling her roughly to his side. "Indeed. Come, Jocelyn. The carriage is waiting. It is time we went home." Jocelyn looked back at Winston as she was dragged away. The Duke stood perfectly still amidst the shadows and the ferns, but his eyes were locked on hers, carrying a silent, ironclad vow. The war had just begun. The heavy mahogany doors of Whitehall were entirely soundproof, but the tension inside the Prime Minister's private office was deafening. It was 3 days after the Devonshire ball. The skies over London had not ceased their weeping, mirroring the grim reality pressing down upon Winston Smith. He stood before the massive desk of Lord Salisbury, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. Salisbury, a man with a famously magnificent beard and a dangerously sharp mind, steepled his fingers, looking at the Duke of Ashbourne with a mixture of immense respect and profound irritation. "You are asking me to sign a warrant for the arrest of one of the most prominent industrialists in the Empire, Winston," Salisbury said, his voice a gravelly rumble. "And you are asking me to do it, based on intercepted whispers from dockworkers and a missing ledger." "I am asking you to stop a traitor, my lord," Winston countered, his hands planted firmly on the edge of the desk. The aristocratic detachment he usually wore like armor had entirely fractured. "Tobias Blackwood is not merely smuggling opium. My informants in Street, Petersburg have confirmed that stolen British naval schematics, specifically the blueprints for the new Trafalgar-class ironclads, are currently being negotiated for purchase by the Russian Tsar. The intermediary matches Blackwood's exact movements on the continent." Salisbury sighed, adjusting his spectacles. "Even if I believed you, and I am inclined to, given your unblemished record, I cannot send Scotland Yard into a peer's home without physical proof. If we are wrong, the financial markets will panic, and the scandal will bring down the government. Find the schematics, Winston. Then you shall have your warrant." Winston turned on his heel, his dark coat sweeping behind him. He had no time to scour the London docks. Blackwood was a cornered rat, and cornered rats always bit the weakest target first. Across the city, in a crumbling, damp-smelling townhouse in Kensington, Jocelyn's nightmare was accelerating. The Whitmore residence had been stripped of its finery months ago to pay off creditors. Only bare walls and faded rugs remained. Jocelyn sat at a small wooden desk, her hands trembling so violently she could barely hold her pen. Suddenly, the front doors blew open. The sound of heavy boots, echoing in the empty foyer, made her blood turn to ice. Tobias Blackwood strode into the parlor, bringing the smell of cheap gin, wet wool, and ozone with him. He was not wearing his tailored society garments, but a heavy, dark overcoat. "Pack your things," Tobias barked, tossing his soaked hat onto a side table. "We are leaving London in an hour." Jocelyn stood, her chair scraping harshly against the floorboards. "An hour? Tobias, the wedding is not for weeks. My father is at his club. He does not even know." "Your father is currently detained in a private room at the Savoy, under the careful watch of my men," Tobias interrupted smoothly, a terrifying, predatory smile stretching across his face. "He will remain unharmed, provided you do exactly as I say." The climate in London has grown decidedly hostile. We are taking my private steam launch down the Thames to the Channel, and from there, to a ship bound for Calais. We will marry in France. Jocelyn felt the room tilt. "France? Why?" Tobias ignored the question. He snapped his fingers, and two burly men carried a heavy, iron-bound velvet trunk into the room, setting it down with a resounding thud. "This is your bridal trousseau," Tobias said, stepping close to her. He grabbed her chin, his fingers digging into her jaw. "It is registered under your name. When we reach the French customs authorities, they will not search the private luggage of a sobbing, overwhelmed English bride. You will keep this trunk by your side at all times. If it is lost, or if you attempt to summon the authorities, I will send word to the Savoy. Your father will not survive the night. Do you understand?" Jocelyn stared at the velvet trunk. It wasn't a trousseau. It was the stolen naval blueprints Winston had warned her about. Blackwood was using her as a human shield and a smuggler's mule, entirely aware that the gentlemen of the customs guard would never dare search the personal effects of a distressed gentlewoman. "I understand," she whispered, her voice hollow. "Good girl," Tobias released her. "You have 20 minutes. As soon as Tobias stepped out to coordinate the carriages, Jocelyn flew to the kitchen. She found the scullery maid, a young girl named Clara whose loyalty Jocelyn had earned through secret acts of kindness. Jocelyn tore a piece of parchment from her pocket, scribbling a single, desperate line. "The river. Tonight. He uses my name. Save my father." She pressed her last silver shilling into Clara's palm. "Run to Piccadilly. Find the Duke of Ashbourne. Give this to no one but him. Run, Clara, please!" The storm that hit London that evening was biblical. Sheets of freezing rain hammered the cobblestones, overflowing the gutters and turning the Thames into a roiling black monster. Winston was sitting in the library of his estate, staring blindly at the fire, when his butler entered, carrying a soaked piece of parchment on a silver tray. A ragged girl brought this to the servant's entrance. "Your Grace." She insisted. It was a matter of life and death. Winston snatched the note. He recognized the elegant, hurried script immediately. "The river. Tonight. He uses my name. Save my father." In a fraction of a second, the Iron Duke pieced the puzzle together. Blackwood knew Whitehall was circling. He was fleeing the country, taking the naval blueprints, and using Jocelyn's name and luggage to bypass port authority searches. And Silas Whitmore was the hostage, keeping her compliant. "Have the carriage brought around?" Winston commanded, his voice deadly calm, though a ferocious inferno had ignited in his chest. "No, strike that. Saddle my stallion. And send a messenger to Inspector Aberline at Scotland Yard. Tell him to raid the Savoy Hotel immediately and secure Silas Whitmore. Your Grace, the weather." "Now!" "Quat," Winston roared, a sound that shook the very foundations of the centuries-old mansion. He didn't bother with an overcoat. He strapped a silver-plated Webley revolver to his hip, threw himself onto his massive black hunter, and rode out into the furious storm. The Duke of Ashbourne, a man who had never so much as raised his voice in Parliament, tore through the streets of London like a dark, avenging angel. He knew Blackwood's shipping operations. If he was taking a private launch, it would be from the abandoned wharves in Wapping, a labyrinth of decaying warehouses and cutthroats. Lightning cracked across the sky, illuminating the skeletal frames of ships docked along the river. Winston pulled his horse up short, as he heard the unmistakable sound of a carriage wheel splintering against wet cobblestones. He dismounted, moving silently through the shadows of an old sugar warehouse. Ahead, lit by the sickly yellow glow of a single gas lamp, was Tobias Blackwood's carriage. It had become mired in the deep, treacherous mud of the riverbank. Blackwood was outside, screaming at the driver, while two hired thugs struggled to pull a heavy velvet trunk toward a waiting steam launch. And there, standing in the freezing rain, shivering violently in a thin, traveling cloak, was Jocelyn. Winston didn't hesitate. He drew his revolver and stepped out of the shadows. "Drop the trunk, Blackwood." The Duke's voice sliced through the howling wind and rain. Tobias whipped around, his eyes widening in sheer disbelief as he saw the Duke of Ashbourne soaked to the bone, his formal attire ruined, a gun leveled squarely at his chest. "Ashbourne?" Tobias spat, pulling his own weapon from his coat. "Are you mad? You are a peer of the realm, not a street corner brawler. You have no jurisdiction here." I am a man who protects what is his, Winston said, his voice dropping to a lethal, vibrating register. He had never spoken truer words. In that moment, the title, the estates, the centuries of protocol meant absolutely nothing. He only cared about the woman shivering in the mud. And you are holding stolen crown property. Let the girl go. She is my fiancée, Tobias roared. She goes where I go. He lunged toward Jocelyn, grabbing her by the throat and pulling her against his chest, pressing the barrel of his gun against her temple. Jocelyn gasped, her eyes wide with sheer terror as the cold steel bit into her skin. Winston's heart stopped. The world around him slowed. He saw the rain bouncing off Blackwood's bowler hat. He saw the velvet trunk sinking into the mud. But mostly, he saw Jocelyn's eyes, wide and terrified, pleading with him to run before he was ruined or killed. Shoot me, Your Grace, and I pull this trigger, Tobias sneered, backing toward the launch. You won't do it. You are a gentleman. You play by the rules. I did, Winston said softly. He holstered his gun. He raised his hands, stepping forward into the light. Let her go, Tobias. Take the launch. Take the blueprints. Just let her walk away. Tobias laughed, a harsh, victorious sound. He relaxed his grip on Jocelyn for just a fraction of a second to wave his gun toward the thugs. Get the trunk on the boat. It was the only opening Winston needed. The Duke lunged. He didn't use a gentleman's boxing technique. He fought with the sheer, savage desperation of a man protecting his heart. He crashed into Blackwood, driving his shoulder into the smuggler's chest. The gun went off with a deafening crack, the bullet soaring wildly into the night sky, but the blast was close enough to burn Jocelyn's cheek. She screamed, falling backward into the mud as the two men crashed onto the wooden planks of the dock. Blackwood was a brawler, heavy and vicious. He brought a heavy knee up, catching Winston in the ribs. The Duke groaned, but refused to let go. He twisted, driving his fist into Blackwood's jaw with a sickening crunch. The smuggler swung his heavy pistol like a club, catching Winston across the temple. Blood immediately mixed with the rain, pouring down the Duke's aristocratic face. "Winston!" Jocelyn shrieked. She scrambled forward, her hands searching desperately in the mud for Blackwood's fallen gun. But she couldn't find it. Blackwood kicked the Duke backward, his face twisted in a mask of pure hatred. He raised his gun, aiming it directly at Winston's chest. Jocelyn didn't think. The instinct was primal and immediate. She threw herself between them, shielding Winston's body with her own. She squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the piercing agony of the bullet. Suddenly, a strong, heavy arm wrapped around her waist, spinning her violently out of the line of fire. Winston pulled her flush against his chest, tucking her head beneath his chin as he shielded her back with his own broad shoulders. "Don't close your eyes," the Duke whispered in the rain, his voice a fierce, ragged breath against her ear. "Look at me, Jocelyn. Only at me." She opened her eyes, meeting his stormy, bleeding gaze. There was no fear in his eyes, only an overwhelming, earth-shattering devotion. Before Blackwood could pull the trigger, the piercing shrill of a police whistle cut through the storm. From the shadows of the warehouse, dozens of uniformed Metropolitan Police officers poured out, led by a stern-faced inspector. Lord Salisbury had sent the cavalry. "Drop your weapon, Lord Blackwood," the inspector bellowed, rifles clicking in unison around the dock. "In the name of the Crown, you are under arrest for high treason." Tobias looked at the wall of rifles, then down at the velvet trunk, and finally at the Duke, who was still holding Jocelyn, as though she were the most precious treasure in the Empire. The smuggler dropped the gun, raising his hands in defeat. Winston didn't watch them slap the irons on Blackwood. He didn't watch them crack open the velvet trunk to reveal the stolen ironclad blueprints. He stayed kneeling in the freezing mud, his arms wrapped tightly around the sobbing, shivering woman in his arms. "It's over," Winston murmured, burying his face in her wet hair, heedless of the blood running down his own cheek. "I have you. You are safe. He will never touch you again." Jocelyn clung to his lapels, burying her face in his chest, overwhelmed by the beating of his heart. The Iron Duke had broken every rule of his station, shattered his flawless reputation, and bled in the mud of Wapping. And he had done it all for her. The dawn that broke over London the following morning was unnervingly bright, casting harsh sunlight onto a city blissfully unaware of the treason that had been thwarted in the mud of Wapping. But within the exclusive, velvet-lined drawing rooms of Mayfair, the storm was only just beginning to rage. Jocelyn Whitmore sat in the modest, rented parlor of a quiet boarding house in Bloomsbury. She was wrapped in a thick woolen shawl, staring blankly at a cup of tea that had gone entirely cold. Upstairs, her father, Silas, was resting under the mild sedation of a physician. He had been rescued from the Savoy precisely as Winston had ordered, physically unharmed but entirely broken in spirit. The full weight of his foolishness and the monster he had almost surrendered his daughter to had finally crashed down upon him. But Jocelyn could not think of her father. She could only think of the blood running down Winston's aristocratic face and the ferocious, earth-shattering way he had held her in the freezing rain. A sharp knock at the door startled her. The landlady scurried to open it, and Jocelyn held her breath, half expecting the Metropolitan Police to arrive with more questions. Instead, a figure stepped into the narrow entryway that made the small, shabby room feel instantly smaller. It was Lord Salisbury. The Prime Minister of the United Kingdom removed his top hat, his gaze sweeping over the worn upholstery before settling heavily on Jocelyn. "Miss Whitmore," the Prime Minister rumbled, stepping into the parlor without waiting for an invitation. "You have had a harrowing night. The Crown owes you a debt of gratitude. Your quick thinking in dispatching that scullery maid undoubtedly saved the Trafalgar blueprints from reaching Russian hands. Blackwood is currently residing in the Tower, where he belongs." Jocelyn stood, her legs trembling slightly. "I only did what was necessary. My lord, how is the Duke of Ashbourne?" Salisbury sighed, leaning heavily on his silver-tipped cane. "He is alive. He possesses a fractured rib, a rather gruesome laceration along his temple, and a sudden, alarming disregard for his own standing in society." The Prime Minister stepped closer, his expression hardening into cold, political pragmatism. "Which is precisely why I am here, Miss Whitmore. You must understand the delicate nature of the peerage. Ashbourne is not merely a man, he is an institution. He is the moral bedrock of the House of Lords." Jocelyn's heart plummeted into her stomach. She knew exactly what was coming. "The society papers are already whispering," Salisbury continued mercilessly. "A duke brawling in the docks? A duke interfering with a merchant's bride? It is scandalous. If the public learns that Winston Smith bled in the mud for the disgraced daughter of a ruined speculator, his political career will be entirely ash. His authority will vanish. You must leave London. Today, the Crown will quietly furnish you and your father with an estate in Cornwall, far from the whispers. But you must never see the Duke again." The words felt like a physical blow, sharper and more devastating than anything Tobias Blackwood had ever inflicted upon her. But looking at the Prime Minister, Jocelyn knew he was right. Winston had saved her life. He had broken his flawless cage for her. The only way she could repay that agonizingly beautiful devotion was to ensure she did not drag him down into the ruin she had been born into. "I understand," Jocelyn whispered, forcing the tears back. She lifted her chin, gathering the last shreds of her dignity. Tell him, I have gone to the country to recover. Tell him I wish him well." Salisbury offered a curt, respectful nod. "You are a patriot, Miss Whitmore. Good day." An hour later, Jocelyn was frantically packing her few remaining belongings into a battered canvas satchel. Her heart was a hollow, aching cavern. She was leaving the only man who had ever truly seen her, the only man who had ever made her feel safe. "And just where do you think you are going?" The voice, deep and resonant, echoed from the doorway. Jocelyn gasped, dropping the satchel. Winston stood in the threshold of the parlor. He looked nothing like the immaculate Iron Duke of the Piccadilly ballroom. He was not wearing a cravat. His heavy coat was unbuttoned, his jaw was shadowed with stubble, and a stark white bandage was wrapped around his temple. He looked battered, dangerous, and impossibly handsome. "Winston," she breathed, the informality slipping out before she could stop it. "You should not be here." The Prime Minister was just. "I know exactly what Salisbury was doing," Winston interrupted, stepping into the room and kicking the door shut behind him with a resounding thud. "I saw his carriage leaving. He operates under the delusion that I am a piece of state property to be managed. I am not." He crossed the room in 3 long strides, stopping inches from her. The heat radiating from him was intoxicating. "He is right," Jocelyn cried, stepping back, though every fiber of her being yearned to fall into his arms. "Winston, you are the Duke of Ashbourne. Your name is centuries old. You cannot be associated with a scandal like this. My father is ruined. I was betrothed to a traitor. If you stay near me, society will turn its back on you. You will lose everything you have built." "Good," Winston said softly. Jocelyn blinked, stunned. "What?" "Let them turn their backs," Winston murmured, reaching out to gently trace the curve of her cheek, his touch sending a violent shiver down her spine. "Let them whisper. Let them strip me of my political appointments. I do not care, Jocelyn. I spent 30 years suffocating in a gilded cage of expectations, playing the perfect aristocrat, while my soul slowly turned to dust." He stepped closer, closing the final distance between them, his stormy eyes burning with an intense, unyielding fire. "Last night, in the freezing rain, holding you in the dark, that was the first time in my entire life I have ever truly drawn breath. You are my oxygen, Jocelyn." "Winston," she sobbed, the tears finally spilling over. "It will be so difficult. They will be so cruel to you." "They can try," the Duke challenged, a fierce, predatory smile touching his lips. "But I am the Iron Duke, and I yield to absolutely no one, especially not when it comes to the woman I intend to make my Duchess." Jocelyn's breath caught in her throat. "Duchess?" Winston dropped to one knee right there on the faded, threadbare rug of the Bloomsbury boarding house. He took her trembling hand in his, pressing a warm, lingering kiss to her knuckles. "Jocelyn Clara Whitmore," he said, his voice ringing with absolute certainty. "I broke every rule for you. I bled for you. And I would burn down the entirety of London before I let you walk out of my life.
Don't close your
Marry
eyes.
me. Not for duty, not for a contract, but because I am entirely, irrevocably in love with you." Jocelyn looked down at the powerful man kneeling before her, seeing past the titles and the wealth, seeing only the man who had ordered her not to close her eyes when death was staring them in the face. She fell to her knees, matching his level, and threw her arms around his neck. "Yes." She wept into his shoulder, clinging to him as he wrapped his strong arms around her waist, lifting her off the ground. "Yes, Winston. Yes." As he pressed his lips to hers in a deep, consuming kiss, the shadows of the past finally dissolved. The Ton could whisper all they wished. The society papers could print their venom. The Duke of Ashbourne had found his true north, and as the afternoon sun finally broke through the London smog, illuminating the small parlor in a wash of gold, Jocelyn knew she would never have to be afraid to close her eyes again. Did you love the breathtaking romance and thrilling twists of the Iron Duke and his defiant bride? If this story kept you on the edge of your seat, please do not forget to hit the like button and share it with your friends. Subscribe to our channel for more spellbinding historical dramas, sweeping romances, and tales of true love conquering all. Tell us in the comments what you want next.